Alright, so Friends to the Death, Chapter 6. With a shaky laugh, Jared bent his knee, raising the kneeling king. Endon, I did not know you either. Get up for mercy's sake. As he stared, his eyes slowly adjusting to the light, he thought that it was no wonder he had not recognized his old friend. The slim, solemn boy he had left behind him 7 years ago had become a man. Endon had grown as tall and broad-shouldered as Jared himself. His stiff robes and high collar were encrusted with tiny gems that glittered in the light. His eyes were outlined with black, and his eyelids were colored blue, in the palace fashion. His long hair and beard were plaited and twined with gold. He smelt of perfume and spices. To Jared, who had been so long away from the palace its ways, he made a strange, awesome picture. Jared realized that Endon was staring at him too, and suddenly he became aware of his workman's clothes, his thick boots, his rough beard, and untidy hair. He felt clumsy and awkward. To hide this, he turned away. As he did, he at last realized where he was. He was in the chapel. One of the marble tiles that surrounded the raised platform in the center had been pushed aside, and a dark hole gaped where it had lain. The tunnel through the hill is known only to the royal family, and is only to be used in times of great danger. He heard Endon say softly, King Brandon caused it to be made when the palace was built. My father taught me of it when I was very young, as he had been taught in his time, in words that even a small child would remember. There is a rhyme for entering the palace, and a rhyme for leaving it. It is a dark secret. Even the chief advisors have never known of it. Jared did not reply. He had raised his eyes to the platform and seen what was lying there. It was the body of an old woman. Her work-worn hands were folded on her chest. Her wrinkled face was peaceful in the flickering light of the candles that surrounded her. Min, he whispered. His eyes burned with sudden tears as he looked at the old nurse who had cared for him through his childhood. He had not seen her for many years, but he had thought of her often. It was hard to believe that she was dead. She had a grown-up son, you know, Endon murmured. He lived in the palace, but I never met him. I asked for him when I heard she had died. They told me he had run away, escaped through the gates during the feast. He was afraid, Jared. Min must have told him what she heard. He knew she had been killed. Killed, gasped Jared, but Endon's face was twisted with sorrow. She came to me in my chamber. I was about to leave for the feast celebrating my 7 years as king, he muttered. She was troubled. She had been working in her sewing room, and had overheard whisperings outside that frightened her. She told me that there were enemies within the palace, and that some great evil was to strike this night. He bowed his head. I would not listen to her. I thought she had fallen asleep over her work, and dreamed. I smiled at her fears and sent her away, and within the hour she was dead. She had fallen from the top of the stairs to the hall below. They said it was an accident, but you do not think so, Jared finished for him, looking sadly at Min's still pale face. You know she was killed because of what she knew. Yes, said Endon in a low voice, and my wife thinks it too. Jared glanced at him. You are married then, he said. I too. Endon half smiled. That is good, he murmured politely. I hope that you are as happy in your marriage as I am in mine. My wife, the queen, is called Sharn. We had never spoken to each other before our wedding day, as this is rule, but she grows more dear to me with each year that passes. Our first child will be born at summer's end. And ours in the early autumn, said Jared. There was a moment silent as each of them thought of the changes that 7 years had brought. Then Endon looked straight into Jared's eyes. It is good to see you again, my friend, he said softly. I have been cruelly punished for believing that you could betray me. I have missed you sorely. And suddenly all the strangeness between them melted away. Jared thrust out his hand and clasped Endon's warmly. Friends to the death we were as boys, and friends to the death we will always be, he said. You must have always known this in your heart, Endon, because you sent for me when trouble came. I wish only that the summons had been sooner. I fear we have little time. Then Min was right, Endon whispered. There is evil here. There has been evil here for a long time, said Jared. And now, both of them swung around, their hands on their swords, as they heard the door behind them clink open. Endon, it is past dawn, a voice called softly. Sharn, exclaimed Endon. He ran to meet the pretty young woman who was slipping into the chapel. She was as richly robed as he, and her glossy hair was twisted high on her head. There was deep shadows under her eyes, as if she had kept watch all night. She gasped and shrank back as she saw Jared. Do not be afraid, Sharn, Endon said gently. It is only Jared. Jared, you came, she exclaimed, her tired face breaking into a relieved smile. I did, nodded Jared, and I will do what I can to help you fight the trouble that has come to our land. We must act quickly. We must go to the once of the tower so that Endon can reclaim the belt of Deltora. Endon stared at him, white-faced. Jared, I cannot, he stammered. The rule. Forget the rule, Endon, Jared hissed, striding to the door. I told you this once, and you would not listen to me. Do not make a mistake a second time. The belt is Deltora's only protection. The people depend on you to guard it, and I think it is in danger, grave danger. As Endon stood motionless, still hesitating, Sharn put her arm through his. You are the king, Endon, she said quietly. Your duty to Deltora is far greater than your duty to obey the rule. Let us go together to the tower. And at last Endon nodded. Very well, he said. We will go together. They ran up the great stairs, past the first floor, the second, the third, and on towards the tower room. They took care to move quietly, but no one saw no one. It was still very early, and though the cooks had begun to move around in the kitchen downstairs, few others in the palace were stirring. By the time they reached the last flight of stairs, Jared had begun to think that all was going to be well. He climbed eagerly, with Endon and Sharn close behind him. He reached the top and then stopped abruptly. The tower room door was gaping open, its 3 gold locks broken. On the floor outside, the 3 guards lay dead where they had fallen, their swords still clutched in their hands. Jared heard a sobbing gasp behind him. Then Endon ran past him into the tower room. There was a single anguished cry, then silence. Jared's heart seemed to turn over in his chest. Slowly he and Sharn followed the king. The small round room was still very small, very still, and a foul smell hung in the air. The sky outside the open windows was filled with angry red light as the newly risen sun glared over a smothering blanket of cloud. The glass case that had sheltered the belt of Deltora had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Endon was on his knees among the glittering fragments. The belt, or what remained it, lay on the floor in front of him. He picked it up. It hung limply between his hands, a tangled, useless chain of gray steel. Its medallions were torn and twisted. The 7 gems were gone. Chapter 7, Treachery. With a cry, Sharn hurried to her husband's guide, gently guiding him to rise. He stood swaying, the empty, ruined belt clutched in his hands. Dull despair settled over Jared. What he had feared had come to pass. The enemy had triumphed. There was a low, mocking laugh behind him. Prandine was standing in the doorway. In his long black robe, he looked as tall and bony as ever, but as if a mask had fallen from his face. The grave, serious expression had gone. Now greed and triumph lit his eyes. Where am I at? And cruelly twisted his thin mouth. So, Jared, you have risen from the dead to try to interfere once more, he snarled. But you are too late. Soon, very soon, Deltora will bow beneath my lord's shadow. Wild anger surged through Jared. He lunged forward, his sword aimed at Prandine's heart. In an instant, the sword burned white-hot. He dropped it with a cry of agony, his hands seared and blistered. You were a fool to come here, spat Prandine. If you had not, I would have gone on believing you safely dead. Now you are doomed, like your idiot king, his little painted doll bride and the brat she carries. From his robe, he drew a long thin dagger, its wicked tip glowing sickly green. Jared backed away from him, fighting back the pain from his injured hand, trying desperately to think. He had no wish to die, but he knew that at all costs he must save Endon, Sharn, and their unborn child, the heir to the throne of Deltora. We are too many for you, Prandine, he said loudly. While you struggle with one, the others can escape. He wondered if Prandine would realize that this was not just a challenge to him, but a message for Endon. While I distract him, take Sharn and run. But Prandine was laughing again, kicking the door shut behind him. There will be no struggle, he jeered, moving forward. The poison on this blade is deadly. One tiny scratch, and the end comes quickly, as it did for your mother and father, King Endon. Murderer, traitor, breathed Endon, pushing Sharn behind him. You have betrayed your king and your land. This is not my land, sneered Prandine. My loyalty, like the loyalty of the chief advisors before me, has always been to another place and to a far greater master. He looked at Endon with contempt. You are the last in a line of loyal buffoons, King Endon. Little by little we robbed your family of power until you were nothing but puppets moving as we pulled the strings. And then at last the time was right to take the last protection from you. He pointed a bony finger at the tangled chain in Endon's hands. Finally, the blacksmith Edin's cursed work had been done. The belt of Deltora is no more. The gems cannot be destroyed, Endon said through his pale lips, and it is death to take them beyond Deltora's borders. Prandine smiled cruelly. The gems have been scattered far and wide, hidden where no one would dare to find them, and when you and your unborn brat are dead, finding them would be of no use in any case. The room darkened, and thunder growled outside the tower. Prandine's eyes glowed with triumph. The Shadow Lord comes, he hissed. Cowering against the wall, Sharn moaned softly. There she seemed to hear something. She sidled to the open window and looked out, not up to the black sky, but down to the ground below the tower. The next moment she had jumped back, covering her mouth with her hand as if to smother a shriek. What is it? Snarled Prandine, suddenly alert. Sharn shook her head. Nothing, she stammered. I was mistaken. There is no one there. Oh, Sharn. Even a child could tell you that you're lying, thought Jared desperately. Thanks to you, whoever has come to help us is doomed. Stay where you are, or she dies at once, barked Prandine to the 2 men as he crossed the room. Sharn shrank away from him as he reached her. Do not look out, there is no one there, she cried again. So you say, Prandine sneered. He thrust his head and shoulders out of the open window, and then the next instant Sharn had crouched behind him, thrown her arms around his knees, jerked his legs backwards and upwards, and tipped him over the still. Jared and Endon, frozen with shock, listened to the enemy screams as he plunged to the hard earth far below. They both stared, astounded, at the small figure turning from the window to face them. Often in the great hall I've watched little clowns upset big ones from below, Sharn said calmly. I do not see why the trick should not work for me. What? What did you see from the window? Jared stammered. Nothing, as I told him, but I knew he would not trust my word. Sharn tossed her head. And I knew he would lean out. Why should he fear a little painted doll like me? Jared gazed at her in frank admiration and then turned to Endon. You are as fortunate in your bride as I am in mine, he said. Endon nodded slowly. He seemed dazed. Thunder growled outside, threatening as an angry beast. Black clouds edged with scarlet were tumbling towards the tower. We must hurry to the tunnel, Jared said urgently. Come quickly. The palace was echoing with frightened voices as they ran down the stairs. The people were waking to darkness and terror. I brought them to this, moaned Endon as he reached the chapel door. How can I leave them? You have no choice, Endon, panted Jared. Your family must survive or Deltora will be lost to the Shadow Lord forever. He pushed Endon and Sharn into the chapel and closed the door behind them. We will go straight to the forge, he said, hurrying towards the tunnel entrance. There we will think what we should do. We must flee the city and find a place to hide, said Sharn. But Endon's hands tightened on the tangled handful of steel that he had once been the belt of Deltora. I cannot run and hide, he burst out. I must find the gems and restore them to the belt. Without them, I am helpless, and Deltora is doomed. Glancing at Sharn's worried face, Jared took his friend's arm. The gems must be found, but you cannot be the one to find them, Endon, he said firmly. The Shadow Lord will be searching for you. You must stay in hiding and wait. But what if I die before the belt is whole again? Endon argued desperately. It will only recognize Idin's true hair. It will only shine for me. Jared opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. Soon enough, Endon would realize for himself that he had lost his last trust his people had in him. The belt of Deltora will never shine for him again. But Sharn had moved quietly to her husband's side. Do not forget, my dear, she murmured. Our child will also be Idin's heir. Endon stared at her, open-mouthed. She lifted her chin proudly. If the Shadow Lord could be patient, so can we, she said. We will hide ourselves away from him now. But it will not be fear for our own lives, as he will think. It will be to keep our child safe and to prepare for the future. She stroked his arm lovingly. Years will pass and we may die, Endon, she said, but our child will live after us to reclaim the kingdom and lift this evil from this land. Jared's heart swelled at her courage, and at that moment he himself found the courage to face what he must do. Endon had gathered Sharn close to him. You are indeed a precious gift, he was murmuring, but you do not understand. Without the belt, our child cannot defeat the Shadow Lord, the gems. One day the gems will be found, Jared broke in. They turned from each other to look at him. We will discuss this further at the forge, he said rapidly. For the moment, remember that now that Prandine is dead, no one knows that you have a friend outside the palace. The Shadow Lord will not suspect that a humble blacksmith could be a threat to him. You will go now to find the gems, whispered Endon. Jared shook his head. I would not succeed now, any more than you would do, Endon. Our enemy's servants will be watching the gems' hiding places for signs that they are in danger. But in years to come, the Shadow Lord will begin to believe that he is safe and watching will become less. Then, and only then, the quest can begin. He held out his uninjured hand to Endon. After this day, we may not meet again in this life, my friend, he said in a low voice. We'll be far apart, and who can tell what will become of us in this dangerous times ahead. But one day the gems will be found, and the belt will be restored. It will be done. Endon took the hand in both his own and bowed his head. Then suddenly the walls of the chapel trembled, as though the palace had been struck by a great wind. We must go, Sharn cried in alarm, as he helped her climb into the tunnel entrance. Endon turned to Jared. You say we must run, that we must hide, but where can we go? He asked in a trembling voice. With the Shadow Lord will come a time of confusion and darkness, Jared answered grimly. Many people will be roaming the countryside, neighborhood will lose sight of the neighbor, and life will not be as it was before. The confusion will aid us. You have thought of a place, whispered Endon. Perhaps, muttered Jared. It will be dangerous, but if you are willing, the chance is worth taking. Endon asked no more, but followed his wife into the tunnel. Jared climbed after him, pulling the marble tile back into place over his head so that no one could tell where they had gone. As the last of the light from the chapel was shut out and blackness enfolded him, he thought of Anna, and his heart had ached. The life they had known had been hard, and they had been happy. Now all this was ended. Fear and trouble were coming. Long years of waiting while Deltora groaned under the yoke of the Shadow Lord. And only time could tell what would happen then. Part 2, Under the Shadow. Chapter 8, Leaf. Leaf ran for home during the dark, winding back streets of Dell. past lighted houses, closed tightly for the night. He ran as far and fast as silently as a cat, his heart hammering in his chest. He was late, very late. He had a hurry, but he knew that the smallest sound could betray him. It was forbidden to be in the streets after sunset. That was one of the Shadow Lord's strictest laws. It had been put in force on the day he took possession of Dell, just over 16 years ago. The penalty for breaking it was death. Leaf slipped into a long, narrow street that ran through the ruined part of the city. It smelt of damp and decay. The stones under his feet were slimy and treacherous. He had been out after sunset before, but not for so long and never so far from home. He wished with all his heart that he had been more careful. It flashed through his mind that his father and mother would be waiting for him, worried for him. "You are free for the afternoon, my son," his father had said, when their midday meal was over. "Your 16th birthday is a special day. Your mother and I want you to be glad and celebrate with your friends." Leaf was overjoyed. Never before had been granted leave in the middle of the working day. Usually he had to study in the afternoons. He had always felt that this was unfair. He was only one of his friends who had lessons to do. Why learn to read and write? Why learn figures in history and worry at mind games? Of course, use were these things to a blacksmith. But his parents had insisted that the lessons go on. And grumbling, Leaf had obeyed. Now he was used to the way things were. But this did not mean that he liked them any better. A free afternoon was the best birthday gift he could imagine. "Tonight there will be another gift, and things we must discuss together," his father said, exchanging looks with his mother. Leaf glanced at their gray faces with quick curiosity. "What things?" he asked. His mother smiled and shook her head. "We will talk of them tonight, Leaf," she said, pushing gently towards her fupa. "For now, enjoy your holiday. But stay out of trouble, and keep track of the time, I beg you. Be home well before sunset." Leaf promised gladly, and ran out of the house through the hot forge, where he helped his father each morning, past Barda, the tattered half-wit beggar who sat all day at the gate and slept in the forge yard by night. He crossed the road that led to the palace on the hill and waded through the weeded fields beyond. Then he ran joyfully on until he reached the market, where he could lose himself in the smells and sounds of the noisy, crowded city. He found one of his friends, then another, then three more. Happily, they roamed their favorite haunts together. They had no money to spend, but they found fun anyway, teasing the stallholders in the markets, running up and down the grimy alleyways, dodging the gray guards, looking for silver coins in the choked and overflowing gutters. Then, in a deserted and overgrown patch of ground not far from the palace walls, they found something better than silver, a twisted old tree covered in small, round, red fruits. Apples. Leaf knew what the fruits were. He had even tasted an apple once. It was though he was very young. In those days, there were still some small orchards in the city. Apples and the other fruits could be brought in the markets, though they were costly. But years ago, it had been declared that all fruits of Dell were property of the Shadow Lord, wherever the trees that bore them grew. This tree had somehow been forgotten, and there were no guards to be seen. Leaf and his friends picked as many of the apples as they could carry and went into the drain tunnels under the city to eat them in secret. The fruits were small and spotted, but they were sweet. It was a feast, enjoyed all the better for knowing that it was stolen from the hated Shadow Lord. An hour before sunset, Leaf's friends left him and hurried home. Leaf, however, was unwilling to waste his last hour of freedom. He stayed in the silence and dimness of the drains, exploring and thinking. He meant to stay only a little while, but then he discovered that Bloodborne, a small drain tunnel branching off from the main leading, he was sure, towards the palace on the hill. He crept along his new tunnel as far as he dared, and Bloodborne was super sick, and then turned back, promising himself that he'd follow it further another day. But when finally he crawled up to the surface, he found that Bloodborne isn't real life. Night had fallen, so now he was in danger. Leaf skidded to a stop as two gray guards turned to a corner in front of him and began pacing in his direction. They were talking, and he had not yet heard him. And then Dark Souls 3 came out, but when they did, he held his breath, desperately looking this way and seeking a way of escape. High walls rose on either side of him, dripping with slimy water and slippery moss. He still hadn't beaten Bloodborne yet. He could never climb them unaided. He could not turn and run either, so he had to play both games at once. To do so would mean certain death. Leaf had prowled Dell Streets all his life, and Halo 5 was pretty sweet, and often met with danger. He prided himself on his many lucky escapes in the past. He was fast, agile, and daring, but he had sense, too. Gears of War was also pretty cool. Sense enough to know that he could not run the length of the street without being cut down. Each guard carried a sling and a supply of what the people of Dell called blisters. The blisters were silver eggs filled with burning poison. They burst on contact with the target, and the guards could hurl them with deadly strength and accuracy even in darkness. Leaf had even seen enough blister victims fall, writhing in agony, to know that he did not want to risk the same fate. Yet if he stayed where he was, the guards would come down on him, and he would die in any case. By blister or by dagger, he would die. Leaf flattened himself against the wall, still as a shadow, not daring to move a muscle. The guards paced on towards him, closer, closer. If only they could turn around, he thought feverishly. If only something would distract them, then I would have a chance. He was not praying for a miracle, because he did not believe in miracles. Few citizens of Dell did these days, so he was astounded when a moment later there was clatter from the corner behind the guards. They spun around and began running towards the sound. Hardly able to believe his luck, Leaf turned to run. Then, with a shock, he felt something hit his shoulder. To his amazement, he saw that it was a rope dangling from the top of the wall. Who had thrown it? There was no time to think or wonder. In seconds, he was climbing for his life. He did not pause for breath until he had reached the top of the wall and swung himself to a great tree on the other side. Panting, he huddled in a fork between two branches and looked around him. He was alone. The rope had been tied securely around the tree's trunk, but there was no sign of whoever had thrown it over the wall. The guards had still not come back into view, but Leaf could hear them nearby, arguing as they reached for whatever had made the sound that he had heard. He was fairly certain that they would find nothing. He was sure that the person who had thrown the rope had also hurled a stone to distract them. That was what he himself would have done if he hadn't tried to save a friend. A friend? Leaf bit his lips as he swiftly pulled the rope up after him. As far as he knew, all his friends were safely in their homes. Who could have known that he was in trouble? He puzzled about it for a moment, then shook his head. This is not important now, he told himself. The important thing is to reach home before anything else happens. He untied the rope, coiled it, and slung it over his shoulder. Ropes such as these were very valuable. He climbed silently to the ground and strained his eyes to see through the darkness. Slowly he recognized the shapes nearest to him. It was an old potter's wheel, broken and lying on the side of the grass. With a chill, he realized he was in the backyard of what had been the city's biggest pottery. 1,000 times he had walked past its burnt-out shell, its gaping front windows, and its door branded with the Shadow Lord sign. The brand meant that the Shadow Lord's hand had been laid upon the pottery. Now it was a dead place, never going to be used or even entered. There were many such buildings and many such signs in this part of the city. A group had tried to resist the Shadow Lord. They had plotted to overthrow him, but he had found out, and he had found out all such secrets. Leaf threaded his way through the huge piles of smashed pots overgrown with weeds. He passed the two great ovens where the pots had been baked, and now just ruined heaps of bricks. He nearly tripped on something buried in the grass, a child's wooden horse, crushed under the foot of a gray guard long ago. By the time he reached the front of the building, he was trembling and breathing hard, not with fear now, but with a sudden terrible anger. Why should his people suffer like this? Why should he have to creep around in his own city like a criminal in fear of branding, imprisonment, or death? He moved on to the deserted road and looked up to the palace on the hill, sick with loathing. For as long as he could remember, the palace had been the headquarters of the Shadow Lord. Before that, his friends had told him the king of Deltora had lived there, in luxury, and the palace was almost hidden by a pale, shimmering mist. But when the Shadow Lord came, the mist completely disappeared. Now the palace could clearly be seen. Though Lee's parents had made him study the history of Deltora from its earliest days, they had told him little of the time before he was born. They seemed to be fear of speaking of it. They say the Shadow Lord had spies everywhere, and it is best to keep silence. But Leaf's friends were not afraid, and they had told him a great deal. They had told him that the last king, like the rulers before him, had cared nothing for the people, and done nothing to serve them. King Andon's only task had been to guard the magic belt of Deltora, but he had been weak, lazy, and careless. He had allowed the belt to be stolen. He had opened the way to the Shadow Lord. The king was dead, Leaf's friend said, and a good thing, too, Leaf thought savagely, as he again hurried for home. The king deserved to die for the suffering he had brought to his people. He reached the fields and began to run, crouching low, hiding himself in the long grass. A few minutes more and he would be safe. Already he could see the lights at home winking dimly in the distance. He knew he would be in trouble for being so late, and that there would be questions asked about the rope he carried. With luck, though, his mother and father could be so relieved to see him they would forgive him quickly. They cannot send me to bed without food, at least, Leaf thought with satisfaction, scuttling across the road and plunging on towards the forge. They say they wanted to talk to me about something tonight. Briefly he wondered what that something was, and smiled at the memory of how serious his parents had looked when they had spoken of it. He loved them both very much, but no two people could be more ordinary timid and quiet than Jared and Anna of the forge. Jared had limped badly ever since he was injured by a falling tree when Leaf was 10. But even before that, he and Anna had kept very much to themselves. They seemed content to listen to the tales of wandering travelers who stopped at the forge rather than seeing life for themselves. Leaf had not been born until after the time of the darkness and terror that had marked the coming of the Shadow Lord, but he knew that many in the city had fought and died and many others had fled in terror. Jared and Anna had done neither of these things. While all around them confusion and panic reigned, they stayed in their cottage, obeying every order given to them, doing nothing to attract the anger of the enemy. And when the panic was ended, and dull misery had taken its place in the city, they reopened the forge gates and began work again, struggling only to survive in their new ruined world. It was something that Leaf himself could never have done. He could not understand it. He was convinced that all his parents had ever wanted in their lives was to stay out of trouble, whatever the cost. He was certain, absolutely certain, that nothing they had said could surprise him. So it was only with relief that he ran through the forge gates, dodged the beggar Barda, who was making his slow way to the shelter in the corner of the yard, and rushed through the cottage door. Excuses were ready on his tongue, and thoughts of dinner were filling his head. Little did he know that before another had passed, everything was going to change for him. Little did he know that he would receive the shock of his life.